Thank you very much. So in following up on the context setting that Jeremy's just done, I'm going to talk through remaking assessment in the digital world and really focusing on what it means for what we might need to be assessing given all of the factors that Jeremy was describing, and also how we might go about it and where the opportunities to leverage technology are. So that's the kind of shape of what I want to spend time on with you. Just a very brief introduction about Sova. We were founded in 2015, and we're a combination of psychologists and technologists, and we focus on building tools for different organisations, generally tailored to their assessment needs. And that can be for screening all the way through to face-to-face assessment. Okay. So a bit of backdrop here on the context of what's happening in terms of digitisation. So the fourth industrial revolution, I'm sure everybody's heard about. I think the point that Jeremy was capturing earlier was that this is actually happening now, this stuff. It's probably fair to say that it's more tasks that are getting automated more than jobs. I think the example of the interview schedulers, there obviously were 100 jobs that have been automated, but in most cases there are tasks being automated, and that's changing the shape of jobs and therefore changing the shape of what we need people to do. So there's a big evolution there and quite a shift in what you want people to do, what technology can do for you, and how that starts to influence what we need. Nevertheless, the World Economic Forum is still saying that 30% of existing jobs might disappear by 2025, which is pretty radical. I think some of that's happening, depending on where you are in the workforce, that's either an opportunity or maybe quite scary, but clearly it's something that we all need to be cognizant of, and from a recruiting point of view, need to be thinking about. A lot of that's driven by digital disruption. Some of the very well-known examples are, Uber versus the taxi, and Facebook against, traditional print media, etc. Amazon and other channels versus the traditional high street. I saw a picture a while back that had, I think, a high street in a regular town in the UK about 30 years ago on a Saturday morning, and then the same high street now. And it was like absolutely astonishing, frankly. It was absolutely rammed 30 years ago. It's pretty quiet, and so all of this kind of shop closures and all of this kind of change, it's been taking a while, and it's continuing at pace, but there's a lot of change in how people use technology to do the things they want to do, whether that's shopping or other activities, right? So all of these pieces of technology are having a big impact. There's also lots of micro-entrepreneurship, as we were talking about, like probably somebody having a sort of a vintage clothing business. That's only really possible often because you might have a shop and then can sell stuff via the internet. 40 years ago, that would have been really hard to make money doing that. It's a lot easier for individuals to get out there and do things as well as in small groups, as well as for the sort of large tech companies to exploit the change. So this is creating huge disruption. And when you think about what that means for existing players, I mean, in reality, most of the organisations that I work with, and I think a lot of you are represented here as well, are companies that have been around a while, actually. Not all of you are in brand new companies. Some of them have quite a deep history. And the real question is, how do you ride that wave and get through it and find out what the next stage of evolution is? An obvious example, but it brings it to the point, I guess. If you look at, say, House of Fraser, obviously Debenhams has had quite a lot of trouble recently as well. Some of the traditional department store retailers have really been struggling for a lot of the reasons I was talking about. One of the ones that we work with, John Lewis, they're not finding it easy either, but they are surviving as opposed to kind of really, really suffering. Yeah, and a lot of that comes down to thinking ahead quite a long way in advance about where the trends are. They've built a very solid online business as well as physical footprint business. Some of their competitors haven't really succeeded in doing that. And alongside that, whilst they've got, like anyone, a long way to go, they have focused a lot on how do they create more flexibility and agility in their workforce. So what does that mean they need from people compared to, say, 20 years ago? So the forethought is really important, I think, and trying to manage and cope with those challenges rather than get sort of overrun by them. Yeah, and we see that in lots of different markets of what's going on. Retail's a really obvious example. So when we start to think about from an assessment point of view, what does good look like? This is perhaps the sort of, particularly for say emerging talent or management roles, we're just picking out here the kind of things that we've probably all been historically looking for and valuing as important, you know. So Jack in this example is very conscientious, very goal oriented, quite structured, values planning, is hardworking, you know, career focused and gets on with stuff. Great, you know, that's a sort of very typical model, but it's quite linear. And that's kind of changing a lot in what we're seeing. You know, in the Zoe example here, she is much more adaptable. She's really motivated by the why, so the purpose of what she's doing. Yeah, prepared to kind of get stuck in and takes a bit more risk, perhaps, and builds rapport quickly and finds ways to cooperate with other people. It's not all hierarchical and following the existing structure. There's a lot more networking involved and a lot more pace involved. So we're seeing this kind of requirement from lots of organisations we work with. To be honest, what we're really seeing is everybody wants both, which is a bit of a challenge because that can become a bit of a unicorn requirement that isn't really feasible. There is an element here about having the right team mix with some of these different skills in and being a bit more tolerant of what we want people to be good at. Yeah. But there's definitely quite a big shift in the style of what's valued in line with this. Does this sort of resonate for other people in terms of what they're seeing? Yeah. Yeah, it's certainly over even just the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a really big change in the requirement of what people are focused on. So that focus on those elements of agility, to use a term to name it, it has really evolved, and that then has an impact on what we need to do in assessment. Now, when we start thinking about putting it into practice, linking back to the poll at the beginning, I think we had scarcity of talent being quite high up the list, and you know there is the stage of finding it. That's not really the bit I'm talking about. But once you've done the process of finding it, the one thing you do not want to do is lose it by taking people through any kind of assessment process which is going to cause attrition of that pipeline of talent. Rather than it being something you have to do, assessment can be something which is engaging and is part of the experience of attracting that candidate. And I think there's a real switch there in how that can be viewed, particularly if you're using technology. So the legacy has sometimes had this kind of shape to it. So you might have had psychometric tools used in screening. A lot of companies are doing that for the high volume hiring. A lot of telephone interviewing or traditional interviewing to whittle down some candidates to the ones you want to see. And then sort of paper-based interviews in assessment centres. Generally, these activities are using up a lot of your time, I expect, or your team's time, to kind of work through what candidates you have. But the problem with that is none of that data is sort of joined up. It's kind of in little pots and puddles, but you can't do much with it, and very fragmented. So that legacy situation in assessment. Whilst there are different tools out there, and as Jeremy alluded to, there's loads of bits of technology out there, not just in assessment, but across recruiting, a lot of them don't really talk to each other very well. And so thinking about this from a platform point of view, how do you get data about your pipeline in one place is a really key point. I mean, it's certainly something we're seeing matter more and more to people. And so just as an example, what we've seen work well is focusing on a sort of whole person view. So rather than a sort of very staged approach, which might have, you know, some testing and then some personality profiling, maybe some situational judgment, some interviewing, you might have like multiple stages, and you tend to lose candidates at each stage because they basically get bored. Yeah, and you're not really getting the best out of it. There are also issues there, but when you do it like that, about adverse impact in terms of gender, ethnicity and age, because of the way you're using different tools that are off the shelf. If instead there's a whole person approach to this, you can be a lot more inclusive about measuring those things that matter about your candidates in one go in a way that's a lot more painless for them and a much better experience, but it's also looking at the whole person in all of the things that matter about them, back to the Zoe and Jack example. And if you do that in one go, you can be a lot fairer, but also a lot faster and make it a much better brand experience than it would be otherwise. Yeah. What we tend to find in terms of integrating data is if you're able to have perhaps online screening, looking at what matters for your organisation. These days that has to be mobile friendly. The elements of it which are looking at and the use of the text, for example, and what people actually say and what their answers are, there's quite a lot of mileage in that area to build algorithms that are good at predicting who the good interviewees are, basically. Yeah. And there's a number of players in the market, again, that are doing good stuff with that. So we're certainly seeing that's one of the trends. I think the sort of fancier facial recognition end of it will become really interesting in time, but it just needs a bit longer. But a couple of really practical examples of where AI will start to make a really notable impact on making everyone's jobs easier to do. And I think for recruiters, it's kind of giving you time for doing the recruiting and less time for sort of dedicated on the administrative side of this stuff. And that's just a follow through. Yeah. So the last point I wanted to just spend a minute on was about outcomes. We talked about candidate experience earlier, and efficiency. I think Jeremy mentioned efficiency, effectiveness and engagement. The effectiveness bit really is the top two. So within the assessment world, the first step is, in terms of prediction, how well is your process actually making an impact? So how frequently is it identifying people that end up being high performers after you hire them, is one of your key metrics. And additionally, if possible, is it able to help you figure out who the high potential people might be? Yeah. These are sort of illustrative outcomes from some of these companies at the bottom. But alongside that, getting the diversity and inclusion side right. If you're doing the whole person approach, there's no reason at all why these two things can't happen at the same time. Yeah. So getting good results on gender balance, on ethnicity, on age, etc., and getting that, and making that a core part of what you're interested in. If you can demonstrate that fair prediction, it then really enables you to drive a lot of efficiency in what you're doing, and because you're able to filter candidates quite intelligently at each stage. There's an example flagged up there, which was from Zurich actually, where they had a graduate program where, having put a much better digitized whole person assessment in place, they were able to pretty much cancel 40% of the assessment centres they had planned, because they filled all of the roles in 60% of the time it took them the year before. Yeah, so they found a lot of efficiency in what they were doing. They'd still planned all of these assessment centres because they didn't know what would happen that year. But once they got into it, the quality of candidate was much better coming through, and so it reduced the amount of administrative time for them. It really made it work much better. But alongside that, why can't this be a great experience for the candidates? If we have a seamless experience that's digitised, that's mobile friendly, may have video and other content embedded in it, we should be using it to attract candidates, and we should be getting good feedback from them about how engaging they found it, right? 85-90% of candidates finding a process engaging is what we should be aiming for. Yeah. If you look at traditional assessment, it might be nearer 50. I'm not 100% sure why even people would. I think it's because they're applying for a job, because filling in questionnaires is not that exciting. But that's what we can be aspiring to really make a big difference. And the benefit of that is you then get faster completion rates and much lower dropout of candidates. So all of the hard work you put in to find people pays off because you're not losing them in the funnel. Yeah, so it drives what you're looking for. So to sum up, the first key point that we were picking off here was thinking about what you actually need to be measuring sort of now and for the future. Anybody you hire now, hopefully is going to be around a while. There may be an immediate task that you want them to do, but you also can have the opportunity to think forward a bit. And so think about the future and start now is kind of the most important point, I would say. Alongside that, a whole person approach to looking at what you need, and then creating a digital assessment process that binds that together is the kind of how of how that can be made to work. Yeah. The data being accessible and then driving some of the analytics, which I mentioned, some of this outcome measurement, there's no reason why you shouldn't have all of these stats available, right? That's the win that then comes back to you from that. But again, the final point here is really think about what you want to measure, think about what the impact needs to be, and build everything around creating real business impact. Okay, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much.